My name is Light T. Cummins, and I am a chairman of the history department at Austin College in Sherman, Texas. And as a native of San Antonio, I am very sensible to the significant role that residents of German heritage have played in the development of this city. Whenever you scrape through the surface of San Antonio history and look inside, you find German immigrant families and their descendants working quietly to build the city that we know today. There are so many examples of that. Indeed, it would be good to point out one that has always impressed me, one of the very first to come to Texas, the Bavarian Ferdinand Louis Huth, who arrived in the Uvalde area with Henry Castro. They helped set up the first colony there, Castroville. Ferdinand Louis Huth eventually came to San Antonio, and in the Civil War years, the family made its home here. For many, many years, the Huth Seed Company on Market Street was one of the Alamo City's preeminent businesses well into the early 20th century. In fact, its seed packets today are collector's items because of the beautiful renderings of flowers that appear on the covers. A grandson of Ferdinand Huth, Albert Huth, was for almost a half century the auditor of Bexar County in the early years of the 20th century. He had 6 children, greatly expanding the scope of the family throughout the history of the Alamo City. It was my good fortune as a young man to know 2 of Albert Huth's children, Patricia Gillis and Elizabeth Coates. They were members of my parents' generation and friends of them. To my mother, they were Patty and Becky, and the result is that, in fact, these 2 women were indicative in their own way of how a German-American family continued to contribute to San Antonio. Patricia Huth Gillis was one of the city's first female attorneys and practiced law here for almost 50 years. Her sister, Elizabeth Huth Coates, was a redoubtable and significant supporter of education and arts. As a high school boy attending Texas Military Institute at the old campus on College Boulevard in Alamo Heights, I took many classes in Coates Hall. Today, you might know that the library at Trinity University bears Mrs. Coates' name. She was significant in a wide variety of endeavors, and as a result of that, now that particular family, moving into the 6th and 7th generation, continues to be indicative of the dozens of German-American families who came in the 19th century in helping create the city we know today. That story can be told over and over and over again in history with names such as Algelt, Becker, Gross, Frederick, Ginther, Helf, Herf, Hildebrand, Holmgreen, Jerzig, Kampmann, Kaler, Oxy, Steves, Wurzbach, and many other families. No one knows the history of German Texas better than our speaker today, Dr. Kenneth Hafertepe, who is the outstanding living authority on the German heritage of Texas. A native of Dallas, he has an MA and PhD from the University of Texas. He has for many years been chairman of the Museum Studies at Baylor University. In fact, the current curator of education here at the Whitty, Amy Mitchell, is one of his students. He has written literally a shelf full of books on the German history, material culture of Texas. This is one of them, Traditions in Translation, a study of Abner Cook and the governor's mansion in Texas. In fact, my favorite is The Historic Buildings of Fredericksburg, a historical guide to that important German community in Texas, and one that is almost too heavy to lift, not only because of its weight, but because it has won this year literally every single award that can be given a book about Texas history, the material culture of German Texas. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Kenneth Khafre.
Thank you. Good to see you guys. It's a little warm in here. We're friends, right? kind of guy. And also have promised not to wander too far away from the microphone, which I'm sure everyone will appreciate. When Germans first moved into the San Antonio area in the 1850s, it was a city that had a long history already. From the era of Spanish colonization into the Mexican period and through the time of the Texas Revolution. And coming to this topic, the part of the challenge was thinking about what am I going to say that's different from any of the stories that we've heard about German immigration. And one thing that I felt very strongly about was to get away from the traditional narrative of they came and they slowly became American over time. But exactly how to do that and what's the reasoning behind that. And one of the things that's influenced the method that I've used in writing these books on Germans in Texas is the study of vernacular architecture, of different cultures, cultural landscapes, but also the sort of cultural fingerprints that they leave behind in the way that they organize their buildings. There are certain ways of building that are Anglo-American ways of building. There are other ways of building that are Mexican or Spanish ways of building. And so that resulted in my going down a very long path of actually 14 years of research that led to these two books on Fredericksburg and on material culture of German Texans. And in so doing, what I discovered two pretty important story arcs. The first is that not only was there this long arc of assimilation, which can be a somewhat controversial word, of the long journey from bringing a lot of Germanic language and Germanic attitudes and slowly over time moving into something closer to what we think of as a Texan mainstream or an American mainstream. But in so doing, I realized that the story arc wasn't quite as smooth as all that there are distinctive ways in between the sort of rough-hewn, handmade pioneering period and the completely finished transmutation into Americans. And in fact, that there is a distinctive German Texan culture that that really existed for a couple of decades before giving way to broader concerns. So that's kind of our story arc, is from original pioneering and Germanic ideas into a period of German Texan distinctiveness, and then into the American mainstream. But it's even more complicated than that. One thing that you can also be looking for as we track these stories through time is that it's moving from handmade craftsmanship. A lot of the people who came from Germany to Texas were carpenters or blacksmiths or cabinet makers. And they were coming at a point where industrialization, the factories, were replacing hand craftsmanship in Europe. And so they were actually incentivized to come to Texas by the fact that they were being replaced by machines. So what we see is the machine chasing these craftsmen across the Atlantic, and because America was also becoming more industrialized, and a transition happens as construction becomes more and more modern. So in that regard, there's a shift from the traditional to the modern. And so those are a couple of clues for you of what we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes. The image that you see on the screen shows San Antonio as William G. M. Samuel remembered it in 1849, and it is pretty much a pure Spanish-Mexican town. Low-slung, one-story adobes. The house on the far corner, and this is the Plaza Mayor, the main plaza. This house that's at the corner of Commerce and Soledad is the house of Sam and Mary Maverick, their first permanent house here in San Antonio. In 1850, they ended up moving over to the Alamo Plaza. We'll talk more about that in a little, but this is the original Maverick house with the infamous tree that is supposedly where a Mexican sniper climbed and shot Ben Milam as he went into the patio of the Veramendi Palace, which is up Soledad Street right there. So it's a very interesting painting, the Casa Real there in the center of this east side of the plaza. And of course, in 1850, the missions still loomed large, even if they loomed as magnificent ruins. Of course, we know there are other reasons why the Alamo, San Antonio de Valera, was a magnificent ruin because of a certain battle in 1836. But this 1849 drawing, watercolor on the right, shows the condition that it was in when it was taken over by the United States Army. And of course, as most of you know, this was adapted to be used as a warehouse by the Army, which meant re-roofing it, which is what we see in this detail from a painting we'll talk about in more detail a little later. But by golly, they went ahead and put a hipped roof on the extant walls of the Alamo. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if you put a roof that's going something like, you need something to cover the front part of the roof there. And of course, that is why they hired a German stonemason named Johann Fries to come in and create a curvilinear parapet that was sort of Spanish-ish or something like that, something that would be appropriate for an old mission. So the Alamo motif actually was installed on the building by a German stonemason. So go figure. The sort of amazing, strange coincidences that happen all the time in San Antonio. Interestingly enough, when you look at the German influence on San Antonio, it can show up in unexpected ways. For example, this is the James Vance House, which was on the south side of downtown. You can see that downtown was really developed at the time of the bird's eye view of 1873 there. I'm being ironic. It's actually kind of neat having that level of detail of the tree plantings there. And this is south, this is the north side. So this is facing to the downtown area. So James Vance, Irish immigrant merchant in San Antonio, doing very well for himself, I'd say, just from the fact that it's this 2-story stone base on top of an English basement. So it's like, whoa, this is a pretty substantial house. But it was remembered by the Vance family descendants that the stonemason of this house was Johann Fries. So it's really a very Anglo-looking house, and the floor plan is quite Anglo with the central passage running through it. When you go in the door there's passageway and staircase up to the upper floor, which was not something that Germans were particularly enamored of in the early days in Texas, and we'll be exploring that a little bit more as well. So even when it's a house for an Anglo individual, you can see the influence of German craftsmanship in the way that those ideas are executed. I liked the point about in terms of the excavation of the dams and acequias and the very regular sort of German stonework that went in the middle of the 19th century. Very telling of Germans being on the job. And in fact, another case where you might not expect to find Germans, this is that second house of Sam and Mary Maverick. Long story about how that came to be, but this was at the northwest corner of the Alamo Plaza. This was probably taken from pretty close to in front of the chapel, but looking to the northwest. And here is a Sanborn map showing the house in July of 1885, with a stone block here, a stone kitchen and laundry block, which you can't see. Maybe you can see right there. And this large pecan tree, which was in their side yard. And the interesting thing is, this sort of arrangement where you have a single room facing the street is actually a type of vernacular form referred to as a Charleston single house. A single house is going to have one room facing the street and the gallery on the side. This is actually further back from the street. It's sort of like a suburbanized version of a Charleston single house because it's pushed back maybe 50 feet from Houston Street right here. But the idea is that you have sort of a courtyard and garden on the side. And Sam Maverick was a native of South Carolina and had done some of his growing up in Charleston. So it makes perfect sense that he would be adapting this coastal southern house type to his own house in San Antonio in 1850. But that's one thing. But of course, the other thing is his contractors for this house were both German. You'll notice that Joseph Schmidt was the stonemason here, and the carpenter was Otto Baumbach. So both in terms of the stonework and the woodwork, Germans were on the scene. And in fact, we know from the wonderful diary of Mary Maverick that she was quite impressed with the stonemason skill of Joseph Schmidt. She wrote in her diary that Mr. Schmidt pushed the work very rapidly. So time's a wasting, get the thing built and up. So interesting in that regard. That tree that was in the Mavericks' side yard is probably this tree right here. And this is a wonderful painting by another German immigrant into Texas, Hermann Lungwitz. There's been a wonderful book by James Patrick McGuire on Hermann Lungwitz, and Light was so kind to mention Traditions in Transition, Change of Material Culture in 19th Century Texas, the Lower South and Southwest, the new David Warren Symposium. This has been out for 2 weeks, and I have an essay in there about Hermann Lungwitz and his paintings as a type of material culture. But Lungwitz and his family actually settled south of Fredericksburg on Live Oak Creek, but he would come in for culture to San Antonio from time to time, and also for work opportunities. This actually became an engraving as well. But this is, in fact, Crockett Street. Here, looking towards the west, you can see the old town of San Antonio off on the other side of the loop of the river, and the church of San Fernando, not yet a cathedral and not yet Gothicized. But the interesting thing is, in addition to Crockett Street, there is the backside of the Alamo right there, and really quite remarkable. That's one of the few images that we have of that side of the Alamo. And then in the street, let's see if I put the detail in the right sequence. Well, let's go back for just a second. There, in the street, you see that there are stone houses on each side here. And this is actually the house of the first German mayor of San Antonio, William Karl August Thielepapi. And in fact, this is Mr. Thielepapi, not yet mayor. This was painted in 1857. And this, of course, is in the collections of the Whitty Museum. There's a carreta here being carried by, moved forward by two Tejanos. And then there's a single guy here, and there's a story that was actually the cabinet maker Wenzel Friedrich, and I've not seen documentation of that, but actually Wenzel Friedrich's house and cabinet shop was just on the south side of the street, which is sort of where the Menger Hotel is right now. Now, do you notice how high the perspective is on this painting? That this is really elevated. We are looking down onto the roofscapes here of Crockett Street, and we're really kind of parallel to the roof line of the newly re-roofed Alamo, so the horizon off in the distance there. Well, how did Hermann Lungwitz do that? Well, the answer, it turns out, is that here is Crockett Street, here's Nacogdoches, here's Alamo Plaza, so here's the chapel right here. And it turns out that here, basically where the old Crockett Hotel is, that was actually Honoré Grenet's store and house. And if you notice, there is actually a tower right here, which is this tower, a 3-story tower. And so apparently Hermann Lungwitz climbed up that 3-story tower in order to get a view over this building. You do not see this building at all, but with a view to the Thielepapi house and the other buildings and the Alamo and the plaza. So now the next question becomes, wow, this photograph is really high up. He's looking down onto the roofs of all of these buildings. How did he do that? And in fact, I should mention that Hermann Lungwitz and Karl von Iwanski became partners in a photography firm in San Antonio after the Civil War. So how do you get this view that's even taller than the tower that he had been in 1857? Any buildings in that neighborhood that we might be thinking of? Like, maybe the Menger Hotel. Then once the Menger is built, then you can drag your camera up the steps inside the Menger and take a photo over to the northern view. And actually looking up Nacogdoches Street, which is looking in the direction of J.H. Kampmann's house and factory. Here's a close-up view for you so you can see Mr. Tila. Now, a very important thing about this, other than identifying who's in it, do you notice the pattern of doors and windows here? This door, window, window, door. When I was growing up in Dallas, if there was a pattern like that, door, window, window, door, I would say duplex, but that was not the case here. This is actually a house that has 2 rooms, separate entry out onto the street. And one of the things that Germans, for their first several decades in Texas, hated the idea of having a central passage because it wasn't really a room. It was just a pass-through area. And they just saw that as a total waste of space. So rather than do that, just either go out the front door and walk that way, or there's a lean-to room in the back. You could go into the back rooms and move around that way. But when you see this sort of arrangement here, this is something that would never be built by an Anglo-Texan, not unless you sort of put their hands behind their back and pulled real hard. But it was something that Germans thought was a rational, sensible way to build your house. And so that's one of the sort of vernacular cultural distinctions, cultural fingerprints that you can find throughout San Antonio houses. In fact, this continues after the Civil War even. If you go over into the King William district, this is 221 Madison. It's probably the Balthasar Benner house around early 1870s. And here we have window, door, door, window. So once again, it's pretty clear from the arrangement of windows and doors that there are 2 front rooms, and it has no central passage. So there was a great deal of resistance among Germans in San Antonio and in surrounding communities, from Castroville to Fredericksburg to New Braunfels, even over to Round Top and Winedale and that area. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the Germans were the only European immigrants coming into San Antonio in the 19th century. Théodore Gentil came from Paris into San Antonio and left a wonderful legacy of paintings. This is a Corrida de la Sandia at the Bryan Museum in Galveston. There's a version here in town as well at the DRT Library. This is another one where there's a pretty subtle manipulation of the perspective, the point of view of the artist. And this is back on the Plaza Mayor. And do you notice how the perspective is lining up right at the level of the canales there? He's very carefully depicting the shadow on the canale so that we know that this is like 1 or 2 in the afternoon even. And Gentil actually has some surviving drawings, and we'll see a drawing for this. Might as well go ahead and show it to you. This one doesn't have it, but in some of his drawings, he's actually delineating the direction that the sun is coming from. So it's really quite remarkable in that regard. But my thought about the perspective of this is that he was perhaps on the wall of the Camposanto, the 4 burial ground in the Church of San Fernando. There's something, if he's not that, he's from a window on the inside of the church, but gives it a distinctive character. One of my other favorite Gentil paintings is another one that's documenting the old Mexican ways. This one referred to as Spanish Dance Fandango. I don't know that the title Spanish Dance Fandango goes back much further than the 1930s. This was in the Yanaguana exhibit of early Texas art in the 30s. This version was probably done sometime in the 1870s or 1880s, but the whole point of it being a Spanish dance seems to be associated with Miss Adelina de Zavala and some of her insistence on the Spanishness rather than Mexicanness of San Antonio, culminating, of course, in the Spanish Governor's Palace on Military Plaza. And in fact, it may be that this painting was being identified as a Spanish dance was to link this room to the Comandancia or Governor's Palace. Although ironically, when it was restored, what Gentil shows are actually very refined. These are carefully hewn rafters here, whereas what you get in the Governor's Palace is actually rounded. They're repurposed telephone poles, to tell you the truth, but it's much more Santa Fe style. The actual documentation of what a San Antonio interior would have looked like in the 1840s suggests something a little more sophisticated than the rustic Santa Fe style that had become popular once again in the 19-teens. So just something to think about there. It's also interesting because the Gentil painting gives us a lot of information about young San Antonians having a good time in the middle of the 19th century. And in fact, you can see that this is a very specific type of fandango, which involves having a candle being held with a young man in the pair. And this is something that's true in the fandango in Mexico or in Spain. So that Gentil is documenting particular styles of dance that have been transported through Spain to Mexico into Texas. Of course, one guy doesn't get the message. He doesn't have a candle here. He has his 6-shooter, and bang! So there's a bit of a commotion about to happen where this painting is. But back to our German friend Hermann Lungfitz. This is the neighborhood where he actually lived, which is off of Live Oak Creek, about 7 miles south of Fredericksburg. And this was actually a painting he was paid to do rather than on spec or having it be a family painting. But this shows the mill and house of Karl Hilmer Ginther and Dorothea Ginther. The center, let's go back, yeah. The center, I'm going to get this right one of these days. Yeah, the dominant feature in the foreground is, in fact, the mill, which has Live Oak Creek coming through. But you'll notice that there is also a rock house, which had just been finished by Karl Hilmer Ginther. In fact, he was commissioning this painting because he was going to send it back to Germany so he could show people how big a success he had been in this new world, Texas. The interesting thing is this house still stands, although it was much enlarged in the 1880s. But check out this. Once again, no central passage. In fact, it was one large room, and you see here the pattern is window, door, window, no central passage, and then a lean-to kitchen in the back. And this is another Germanic way of thinking about things. And in fact, sometimes when Germans, thinking in a vernacular way, doubled their house to have 2 front rooms, you can see it go window, door, window, window, door, window. There are some examples of that in Fredericksburg. So it's just sort of keep repeating. If the formula worked once, it sure will work well again. The interesting thing is that the Ginthers had purchased this land from some Anglos who had built some log houses, which are Lungfitz shows them as being way off in the distance. And it's sort of symbolic that the Anglo ways here were being supplanted by superior German stonemasonry and ways of living. But, of course, as you know, the 1850s was quite a droughty time in Texas, and the mill did not do particularly well. Karl Hilmer Ginther decided to move his family into San Antonio and, maybe build a new mill on the San Antonio River, sort of south of town, kind of King William-y. And this is actually the original Ginther House, now a lovely restaurant. And interestingly enough, this is a house that I would dearly love to see some evidence of what the floor plan of the house is. So if anybody has, let me know, because it basically was quite dramatically rebuilt in 1914 by later generations of the family. This was added in 1873, what we now know as the parlor. But this front part, which interestingly enough faces not San Antonio, but towards the mill, got to keep your eye on that mill, and so there's the mill there. But when you look at the front side of the house, go around the corner here, and it's window, door, window, but it looks like there could conceivably be a central passage there. Was Karl Hilmer Ginther the first German to decide to adopt the central passage in that particular way? I'm still not completely convinced. But what we do know is that after the war and as prosperity continued for the family, he builds this very nice new parlor facing towards town and towards the other homes in King William. So pretty interesting in that regard. Other homes are going up at about the same time in King William. The Gustav Blersch House on Washington Street around 1859, which you can actually see as a detail on the bird's eye view of 1873 here, plus the Auger House. And this is still standing today and a wonderful treasure of King King William. This is interesting because you can see that the main floor is elevated up so that there's actually kind of a English basement. It's half above ground, half below ground. And so there are actually steps that you can go down outside. And the Blairsh House does have a central sort of a passage, but it's a super wide passage with no staircase. Without the staircase, it becomes more of a room for living. And so Germans are okay with that. But just don't expect them to have a central passage with stair. In this case, the stair was probably on the back side of the house, although you're not really seeing it here. Germans became quite prominent in building hotels. The Menger Hotel, designed and built by John Fries, who we've heard about in terms of the Alamo Ironworks and also the Vance House, and J.H. Kampmann, who was another stonemason immigrant into San Antonio. You see here an early photographic view of the building. You'll notice that there are actually cast iron balustrades, 3 separate ones for each of the 3 upper floor rooms, imported from San Antonio. That was possible. It still had to be, shipped by cart from Indianola or Galveston. But this was at almost exactly the same time that Ashton Villa and Galveston got a cast iron porch. It's very interesting because the Sanborn map of 1885 gives you all the functions of the different rooms here, including this being a saloon. This is sort of the entry part of the hotel. There's all down here, which is sort of beyond, there's a billiards. And of course, as you know, the Menger has now expanded to include all of this because this is Crockett Street right here. So that now takes up the entire block. But this 3-story part down here was dining room on the first floor and then sleeping rooms on the second and third floor. So even at an early date, Germans are making major contributions to the development of the commercial life of San Antonio, and doing it with a sort of austere neoclassical appearance. So quite interesting in that regard. Not too far away from that, that's at Market and Casino, is the John and Regina Beckman House, built around 1860 and built by John H. Kampmann. A historic photo here shows you the house, which is facing to the west. And unfortunately, this is the area that's now parking lot for the River Rock Spanish restaurant. Let's see, Casa Rio, yes, thank you. Lost a very nice German Texan house, very austere, very simple. It has a little bit of cornice on the front, but it doesn't continue on the side. There's a 2-column porch that's right there. Interestingly enough, this is a scan that was made from a original photo that was lent to me by Mrs. Amanda Oxy. And when you scan it to this level, you can see that this isn't just plaster or stucco slopped on the exterior. There are actually very carefully scored lines so that it's rubble stone, but then plastered and scored to look like more regularized bricks. If let's put it this way, if Germans couldn't afford those super regularized stones, they would sort of make you think they could. And this is a useful image to have because this is immediately across from the old Casino Club. And here, in fact, is a view from the yard of the Beckman House over to the Casino Club. This is 1857. This is not the Casino Club that we know today. But in fact, this is where the Briscoe Art Museum is. So it was replaced by the San Antonio Public Library and now the Briscoe. But you can see all the functions of this building, the center block being a theater, but there's billiards, there's a parlor, there's a bowling alley, all sorts of stuff. And Germans were very concerned about having centers for socialization, for Gemütlichkeit, for good feelings of sociability and comfort, and that sort of thing. And so it's important as a cultural institution, and it's also important as a pretty characteristic version of German neoclassicism. Obviously, there was neoclassical architecture in the rest of Europe and in the eastern United States, but brought with a specific German accent to to San Antonio. And here's a great painting by Karl von Iwansky, from the collections of the Whitty here, showing the interior, the main space, that theater, which is very cool because you get to see the theater area, the stage area of the theater, but a lot of German Texan society, goodness, German mingling. I hope they're paying attention to the play. It looks like they're having too much fun schmoozing to actually be listening to the lines here. But check out this painted backdrop here, which may well have been done by Iwansky or by his partner in photographic endeavors, Hermann Lundqvist. So it's a fascinating painting and a cultural statement of the sort of cultural sophistication to which Germans aspired from a very early date. In fact, Frederick Law Olmsted, when he was visiting out in the area between San Antonio and Fredericksburg, right in the area around Sisterdale, there was a little German community there, and they were Latiners, a very educated group. And so he had dinner in a log cabin that was the sort of frontier pioneer house. And after they finished dinner, well, what do we do now? And someone says, hey, I know, let's sing all the arias from Don Giovanni. Yeah, great idea, let's do it. So they did. And it's another world out there. Even in a pioneering frontier situation, the Germans brought with them a lot of their culture, their learning, music, opera. Even on the frontier, there was a concern for that sort of thing. Now, that's not uniformly across the board, all Germans, because we're talking about a very educated group there. But nevertheless, it tends to blow up our images of what life was like in pioneer Texas. Now, another immigrant who made some significant cultural statements here in San Antonio is Louisa Wusti. She was trained as an artist back in Germany. In fact, she was from a very artistic family, and one of her sisters married a painter in Dusseldorf. This watercolor here is of Gummersbach, which is the town that she grew up in, that Louisa grew up in. So obviously, even her aunts were very artistic as well. This is a portrait of Louisa, undated, so it's unclear whether this is from her Texas period, which started in 1859, I believe it was, or from her German period. But her husband, who was a doctor, passed away, and all three of her children had decided to move to Texas. What do I do? She decided, I better move to Texas. There's sort of the maternal instinct there, but in the case of Louisa Wusti, she was also quite ambitious, having hung out with painters like Carl Friedrich Lessing and Carl Friedrich Zohn, who was actually her professor, the guy in the middle there. Theodor Hildebrandt became a German gallery director, art museum director. So she's hanging out with a lot of significant people. Both of these are in the collection of the Whitty, and they're really quite wonderful. The self-portrait of Louisa, and then a portrait of her daughter, Adelina Wusti Staffel. And the Whitty actually has the best collection of her work. And I must say, Louisa is still waiting for her first one-woman show. It hasn't happened yet, but by golly, it's going to happen one of these days. It's interesting here, the kind of background on her paint, the portrait of daughter Adelina, this sort of misty blue-green background here. And, it's almost sort of Mona Lisa-esque, you might think, if you want to go full-bore Italian Renaissance. Or actually, let's go back. Check out the sort of blue sky, that sort of pale pastel blue in the painting of Jung Dusseldorf there. And I think that Louisa is very much aware of that sort of background tradition. This is at a point where, so many Anglo-Texan portraits are the sort of black or super dark background, and there's just the body bathed or the head bathed in light. But there's more attention to detail in this particular painting. Madame Louisa Wusti was ambitious enough to advertise both in Galveston, where she ended up for a little while, and in San Antonio, will execute paintings, drawings, and portraits in oil, will also make patterns for needlework of all descriptions, and will give lessons to pupils in the above branches. Residents, and this is in Galveston, residents on Tremont Street between Market and Post Office. That turned out to be not a very long residence, but she moved to San Antonio, and this is a woman who's determined enough to rent studio space in the new French building that had been completed just a couple of years before. This is at the southwest corner of the main plaza. So she was dead serious, and presumably it was one of these rooms right here. She would have wanted the north side because as a painter, she wants that consistent light throughout the day without the sun changing so often. So she was extremely professional as an artist. And that thing about teaching is critical too, because she ends up teaching art at the German-English school. And the bird's eye view here shows the German-English school, but it turns out her daughter Adelina was living right there with her husband Heino Stoffel. And so this is very much the neighborhood. And here's a image of the German-English school, the two earliest buildings from 1964. This is sort of in the run-up to Hemisphere. And here is Adelina's house, which is now part of the Marriott Plaza San Antonio. So you can actually stay in Adelina's house if you want. It's by the pool area. But interestingly, in 1870, Louisa was living nearby with the family of Louis Gresser. I think that the house may have been too small for daughter and son-in-law and all of their kids. I think Louisa probably wanted a little peace and quiet by this point. She also painted this wonderful portrait of Sarah Riddle Ager. Here's a black and white photograph, and here's her house, which is still standing on Alamo Street, designed and built by J.H. Kampmann. But this is an Irish-American couple, and so they have a central passage with a staircase. And so a German will build you a central passage. It's not rational, but we'll do it if you want it. Vista also did the portrait of the children of General Hamilton B., who was a Confederate general. LW is her way of signing down here, but the four children, but set into a background, very characteristic. And it's interesting because her brother-in-law, Carl Friedrich Lessing, did this painting of the robber and his child, which is a sort of a Les Miserables kind of story. But all of the rock work here and this vista off into the distance, I think she's recalling that when she was painting the children of Hamilton P. This is at the Winedale Historical Center now. She certainly crossed paths with Karl von Iwansky, his famous painting of the Terry Rangers from the middle of the Civil War. The story tends to be that this figure here is Sam Maverick the Younger. I'm trying to figure out right now how accurate that is, but it is interesting seeing this rambunctious group of young men, although Terry's Rangers actually was organized in Houston, never came to San Antonio. And Mary Maverick records that when Samuel Augustus went off to war, he had already been in the war in another unit and then re-upped in Terry's Rangers. So it's sort of a composite, let's put it that way. But compare this, the painting of Terry's Rangers and a photo of some of Terry's Rangers, and you can see the uniforms, especially this dude and that dude. You can see the connections. And in fact, Iwansky was both a painter and a photographer. So who took this photograph? Wouldn't you like to know? I would like to know. As we move into the period after the war, you get more very solid, no-nonsense German houses, like the house of J.H. Kampmann on Nacogdoches Street. Here's the house, and there's also this long barn complex and servants' quarters and all sorts of stuff. But this is J.H. Kampmann's sash, door, and blind factory. So Germans are actually not just coming and providing excellent handwork craftsmanship. They're leading the way into the industrial era. So that's something that's critical to remember in this context. Here's a half of a stereoptical card showing the garden of the Kampmann House. And check out this beautiful ceiling, painted ceiling in the parlor. And if you go to the 1877 city directory, you can actually make out his whole building crew just by all of the people who identify themselves as working for Kampmann. And it's interesting because it is kind of segregated. Kampmann, Carl Otto, stonemason, Bernard Behrman, carpenter. And then you get to a group of laborers, Marco Bravo, Quintero Blas, A. Valenzuela. So they're all Tejanos. And then there's a specialist who's involved as well, Joachim Blessy, who's a painter from Switzerland. Go figure. And so I think Joachim Blessy is probably the person who's doing that. And then son Gustav Kampmann joins the firm by 1880 as a stonemason. But the other thing to think of here is that Germans were not just looking to assimilate with local San Antonio culture. They ended up becoming cultural leaders in the community very quickly. And by that I mean, here is the Anton and Paulita Wolff House at the head of King William Street. Check out the similarity between this and this design from Samuel Sloane's The Model Architect of 1852. And this is one of the earliest Italianate houses in the state of Texas. And so it's not just, we're going to merge in. We're actually going to show the local population what's happening on the East Coast in America. So very interesting to think about that. Or another interesting house in King William is the Ernst and Emma Altgeld house, which looks like it's going to be an Anglo side passage, sort of a go in the door and there's a passageway, staircase, and then a double parlor on this side. But the interesting thing is when you go around to the side here, there's a side passageway and there's a big yard this side. And here, in fact, it is. There's the house. There's the gallery. There's the yard. It's another Charleston single house. And that becomes true in spite of the fact that, when you go in the front door, you're not in a central passageway. What a waste of space. We're going to have one big front room. Thank you very much. And so even when interpreting Charleston single passages, they have to kind of put a German spin of what's the rational way of using space in a house. And in fact, there is what was originally the only staircase to the second floor. It was outside. So, rational? I don't know. Well, or is it German cheapness? Is that what we're really talking about here? But interestingly enough, when this was restored in the 1940s, the architect created a second staircase on the inside, the front of the second room in the house. But all very interesting, and in fact, the doors lead out into from each of the main rooms onto that gallery there. Back to Ivansky, he ended up going back to Germany to take a refresher course in painting and came back and did some wonderful portraits of some of the leading San Antonio citizens, including German Texans. And this, of course, is Edward Steeves and Johanna Steeves, 1873 and 1872. He had gone in 1871. And I think they were probably so pleased with this that Ed said to Johanna, we really need a house that's worthy of these paintings. And so what did they do? They built a grand new house designed by Alfred Giles. Now, Giles, as you may know, is not a German name. It's English. He was an emigre from England. And, like the Wolffs, the Steeveses are thinking, okay, this could be the next new thing. And so they build this house and then ended up building houses for two of their sons at King William and Johnson. And you can see that they were actually riffing on A.J. Bicknell's Village Builder, which was a pattern book from the 1870s. So again, the Steeveses, like the Wolffs, are very concerned about what is fashionable in the East Coast. So they're slowly dragging San Antonio into the Victorian era here. And the interesting thing is, as those of you who have been into this house know, is that when you walk in, by golly, there's a central passage and it's got a staircase. It's like, okay, all right, so they're slowly abandoning, well, not in this case, not slowly, they're pretty dramatically abandoning those old German attitudes, which may have something to do with the size of this house. That this is actually 4 rooms down, 4 rooms up, and when you get to that level of organization, you need to have a passage to get from one room to the other. And check out the division between the sitting room in front and the dining room. And here's another plate from Bicknell's Village Builder. And check out that door right there, which I think they sort of souped it up by making solid wood panels into glass panels. But quite clearly, this is kind of their dream book. And they're flipping through it and finding the things that they like and changing the things that they don't like and telling Alfred Giles and J.H. Kampmann what they needed to be doing. Another early German painter who studied with Hermann Lundqvist is Ida Weiselberg-Hadra. This is Ida right here, and here she is with her sister Emma. I really think they probably could have used a chill pill. They look pretty serious here. But she actually flourished under the tutelage of Hermann Lundqvist and Emma Moss de Ball, and exquisite studies of trees, which are very much the sort of things that Hermann Lundqvist was learning to paint back in the Academy of Fine Arts in Dresden. And she ends up doing this wonderful painting here at the Whitty of the San Antonio River at St. Mary's Street, which is actually Navarro. Long story, but you can kind of track that. And also this view of the San Antonio, the old iron foundry on the San Antonio River. Light mentioned the Holmgren family, and the Holmgrens were the founders of the Alamo Ironworks, which, interestingly enough, by the time she painted this from the Navarro Street Bridge, they had moved their factory. It was and this is right around the public library now, and they had moved to the east in order to be near the new railroad tie-in, because that was absolutely critical to have materials in and to be able to ship their product out. And here you can actually see the area, and it's right where the Casino Club was as well. She managed to avoid having the Casino Club in her picturesque painting. But a few more of the sort of houses that you get in King William. You also see Germanic contributions to church building, St. Joseph's Catholic Church, designed first by Gustavus Freisleben, who came up in the talk about the acequias, and then Francois Giraud, who actually came up in that talk as well. And check out the rectory there, which looks like it could have been in King William district, and very much from that same sort of Bicknell's Village Builder. And St. John's Lutheran Church by James Warrenberger and Albert Beckman, two Texas-born young men who went back to Germany and studied architecture in Germany. So they come back and it's sort of like reinforcing, strengthening the German connections. This is actually showing the original interior of the church here, and then it got souped up with painted decoration. It was actually one of the painted churches of Texas. Most of the painters of those churches tended to be Germans from here in San Antonio. Finally, the last couple of slides takes us through that story arc one last time, from the handmade to the commercially produced. This is an image from Terry Jordan's wonderful book on Texas graveyards, showing the oldest gravestone in the New Braunfels Cemetery, which is actually not true. It's the oldest dated one, but there are ones that were made earlier than this. But thank God for Terry Jordan, because he actually captured it, and you can see it's signed A. Altman, San Antonio. And you can no longer see that. This stone is now flat on its back with weeds growing over it, and it's a shame because it really is quite beautiful. But you can see other, this is actually in City Cemetery number 1 here in San Antonio, and probably from the Altman shop as well. You see a shift from that probably more nearly Germanic style to sort of typical late neoclassical and early Victorian styles. Both of these signed by Zevin and Altman, this one in Oddfellows and this one in City Cemetery number 1. Interestingly enough, these are by Frank Teich, or Teich, who, this is in San Fernando number 1, and this almost identical one for Johann Fries is in City Cemetery number 1, and they're both signed, and it's great when you can pick up the signatures. But when you get to this point, when you get to this point, you are following national norms, and this is white marble that's been imported into San Antonio, no longer using the limestone. And Frank Teich, actually, here's his business card for Granite and Marble Works. He had his marble yard very near to the Ginther Mill, and that was tied into the railroads as well. So that was another strategic location to have a marble works. And remember Alamo Ironworks, that was the abandoned site, was on the Hadra watercolor. And here are some crosses, iron crosses, in the New Braunfels, St. Peter's and Paul's Catholic Cemetery of New Braunfels. And on the back of these is stamped Alamo Ironworks, San Antonio, Texas. So the industrial process, the Germans embraced that, find new ways of bringing permanent grave markers like this. And as they liked to say, it's more durable than wood and it's cheaper than wood. And finally, the two of the distinguished families we've been talking about, Edward and Johanna Steeves, and Karl Hilmer Ginther and Dorothea Ginther, both of granite, and that's an industrial, it requires industrial machines to cut this. So it would have been impossible in earlier generations. But interestingly enough, the one on the left, the Steeves one, is by Zevin and Altman. This was the first granite monument in San Antonio. And they were bragging about the technology that they had brought in. And at the end of the day, this is the final slide. At the end of the day, you find the ability to document things by the use of photography. This is a photograph of the parlor of the Ginther House, which is pretty commonly reproduced. It's a well-known photograph. The interesting thing is Mrs. Amanda Oxy lent her version of this to me so I could get a really high-res version. And on the back side, it specifies that it's the parlor, but also that it was taken November 14th, 1902. Now that's an interesting date, because that was about 4 weeks after Karl Hilmer Ginther died. So this isn't just a random photo. Oh, let's take a picture of the parlor, see how it turns out. This is a photo, and Dorothea had died about 4 years earlier. And so Karl Hilmer was going to the other side of town to the city cemetery. But this is a memorial photograph showing, preserving one last time the parlor as it had looked during Karl Hilmer's lifetime. So it's a remarkable story, a remarkable series of transformations that happened, fundamental ways in which German Texans have affected the culture and feel of San Antonio.
All right, we have a few minutes. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am. Someone should have a microphone. You have a...
Is the Kampmann House, the one they lived in, still standing?
No.
Oh.
It's actually very near the Masonic temple that has the great auditorium. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, the question was about the Kampmann House, and it's actually in the area over by the Masonic temple and auditorium right there. So, alas, that whole area is really kind of devastated and sort of parking lots.
Part of the Kampmann House, however, was moved to the new Kampmann House on Kings Highway.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Louis. Although, hold on. I believe that the Kampmann House, the part was moved from, was actually Kampmann Jr., which was about 3 blocks. That's a long story, but yes, there are definitely remnants of 19th century Kampmann houses up in the area, sort of near Trinity, right? Okay, yeah, that's a good point.
And I think there's a question in back, or was there? Yeah, here it is. Yep. Okay, yes.
I wanted to know if you could tell me where the German Texans who ended up in San Antonio came from. Did they come at the same time Castro did, or did they come on that German Trail of Tears that went to Fredericksburg?
Yeah.
Or which?
The Castro was at the very beginning of the immigration process, and that was particularly recruited from the Alsatian area. In fact, the first book about Castroville, Le Texas, in 1845 is bilingual. It's German and French. So they were sort of a separate group under the impresario Henri Castro. I'm sure that there were some people who came on that route from Indianola to New Braunfels, which turned out to be so catastrophic, and all resources have been sucked up by the U.S. war against Mexico, which resulted in the deaths of a lot of people coming in. I'd be loath to give you a particular figure about how many that was, but the immigration continued pretty consistently over a 10, 20, 30-year period. Stops pretty sharply in 1861 with the Civil War, but then restarts again. There are new incoming immigrants in the
if I may, just a quick
absolutely.
change to that. By the era after the Civil War, as was the case with the Huth family of Castroville, San Antonio became a gathering place for second-generation German Texans who were the children of those that had been dispersed in other parts of the state. A lot of hill country families, the children of original immigrants, ended up in San Antonio, as was the case with the Ginthers. And so San Antonio is a much more polyglot German population in the 19th century from different parts of Germany, but still very Bavarian than other parts, the hill country and the Castroville area, where they tended to be more atomized and distinct. Yes, that's correct. San Antonio, in many respects, is a second-generation German center where the successful children of the immigrants came.
Mm-hmm. And much like the Ginthers had moved back into San Antonio, so too Hermann Lundqvist and his family moved into town during the Civil War because there were lots of shootings and hangings out in the hill country if you weren't enthusiastic enough about the Confederacy.
I think we have
so
time
it was a lot safer.
For one last question here.
Just a quick question about you mentioned Sisterdale, and what was the predominant philosophical or possibly even religious thinking of a lot of these immigrants?
Yeah, Sisterdale tended to be more of the Freidenkers, the free thinkers, who tended to be unaffiliated religious-wise. So, we saw images of the Catholic and Lutheran churches, and the Lutherans out in the hill country were probably somewhere around 60% Catholics, another 25% or something like that. And then there were some Methodists, and then the unaffiliated. So Comfort was actually a community founded in the 1840s that did not get a church until the 1890s. So a lot of the Germans who were coming to America were coming for freedom to worship as they saw fit, or not to worship at all. We saw the Beckman House, the Little Rock House. One of them, I forget whether it's John or Regina, was in a Protestant area, and the other was in a Catholic. I believe Regina was from the Catholic area, and they couldn't get anyone to marry them, and so they basically emigrated together as single individuals, got off the boat in New York, and found a minister who would marry them. Even the being from a religious area and wanting to be religious, they were kind of forced to move just to be able to live together as man and wife.
In closing, let me make the observation that in 1982, the Texas Monthly Magazine published a piece on San Antonio, apparently by a journalist who was not too familiar with the city. He said that the German history of San Antonio constituted one of the great unknown stories in the history of Texas. And I'm happy to see that today, this particular session has helped give additional clarification to that misstatement. So thank you.